Action.
Good evening and welcome. My name is Thad Zulkowski. I'm the Deputy Director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, which was founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in 2007. As always, I'd like to thank Shelby for her steadfast support of the Biography Center. It's her vision that makes this program possible. Our next event, which will be on Zoom only again, will be on May 17th, also at 7 p.m., when Chad Williams will discuss his new biography of W.E.B. Du Bois with David Levering Lewis. Please mark your calendars and register for this free event on the Leon Levy website. Tonight, we are delighted to welcome Peter Stansky, who will be in conversation with Joseph Kanon about Peter's new book, The Socialist Patriot, George Orwell and War. Now, this book can be ordered from the Stanford University Press website at a 20% discount with the code Stansky20, and I've put this information into the chat for everyone. Peter Stansky is the Francis and Charles Field Professor of History Emeritus at Stanford University. He has published extensively on the cultural, political, and literary milieu of 20th century Britain, including with William Abraham's The Orwell biographies, The Unknown Orwell, and The Orwell Transformation. Joseph Kanon is the Edgar Award-winning author of The Accomplice, Defectors, Leaving Berlin, Istanbul Passage, Los Alamos, The Prodigal Spy, Alibi, Stardust, and The Good German, which was made into a major motion picture starring George Clooney and Cate Blanchett. His most recent book is The Berlin Exchange. He lives in New York City. Stansky and Kanon will be in conversation for about 45 minutes and will then open the floor to a few questions from the Zoom audience. Please type in your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and they will answer as many as they can, time permitting. Well, please welcome Peter Stansky and Joseph Kanon.
Action, go.
Good evening, and thank you for coming. I am here because many years ago, more years than I'd care to count, I was, as an undergraduate, lucky enough to be admitted into a very popular course in modern British history. The popularity came not necessarily from the students' wild enthusiasm for the subject, but for the young professor who was teaching the course and whose lectures were said to be terrific. They were terrific, and all these years later, I'm still learning from Peter. I've come to California, which was a great excuse, so that I could be with you and talk to him about The Socialist Patriot, his latest book, The Socialist Patriot. Is everything okay with our?
Yes, fine, go ahead.
Okay, thanks so much. Technical glitches will happen. Anyway, as I was saying,
Mute.
Can you see and hear us now?
Yes, it's fine now. You can go.
Okay, thanks so much. I'm sorry for the glitch.
Don't worry about seeing yourselves, just talk.
Right. Anyway, I've come to California where Peter lives so that we could talk this time about his new book, or his latest book, George Orwell, Socialist Patriot. This is the third time Peter has written a biography or a biographical book about George Orwell, and there's a lot of territory to cover. But since this is the Levy Center for Biography, and I think there's an interest as much in form and process as there is in the subject of the biography itself, let's start with the book. How did Orwell fall into your life? Why were you so interested? And since you are widely credited with unblocking the Orwell biographical stream that was being held up by its very vigilant estate, How did that happen? Let's start with a little biography.
Yes, thank you very much. And before trying to answer, it's rather amusing that we have these technical glitches as we have the computer age, which Orwell, the current interest in 1984, is very much boasted by the feeling in 1984 that computers can take us over. And I think a lot of us are now feeling that AI is about to take us over. And in a way, it's a deeply Orwellian moment. And that we had these sort of technical glitches at the beginning is somehow symbolic. But let me also say how grateful I am that Joe, my old friend Joe Kanon, and that he's here with his lovely wife, Robin. And in fact, permit me to mention that Joe and Robin are the dedicatees of this book. So it's particularly appropriate that we should be doing this session. The book begins. The present book, The Socialist Patriot, and you see the jacket behind me. And also, while I'm on that, I should mention that the young man that you can barely see, the photograph behind me of the young military man is actually of George Orwell when he was a police officer in Burma. But my own interest in Orwell began more years ago than I almost care to remember.
The camera is still muted.
When 1984 was published in June 1949, when I was a senior in college, not in college, in high school, and my parents belonged to the Book of the Month Club. And it was selection, which was very good for Orwell financially. And so I first read Orwell with the publication of of course, I was too young to have read his previous books, but of course, eventually I did. And so I was interested in Orwell beginning when 1984 was published. I then went to Yale. And at Yale, I became very interested in British studies, and particularly where I'm a historian, and I study these things for what they tell us about the history of the country. But when in England and Britain, and of course people are maybe more aware of this than usual because of the coronation, where history, society, literature, the arts, politics, they commingle. And I became fascinated, particularly by this mingling that could be found in literary figures who are politically involved. And so I wrote a senior essay about 4 Englishmen who participated in the Spanish Civil War. I had always been very interested in the Spanish Civil War because when I was growing up, and when one's growing up, these are very influential times. There's this wonderful album of songs of the International Brigade, and somehow it captured my imagination. And so I ended up writing a senior essay about 4 Englishmen who had participated in the Spanish Civil War: John Cornford, Julian Bell, Stephen Spender, and George Orwell. And then, coincidentally, perhaps I'm going on too long, coincidentally, Homage to Catalonia, his absolutely magnificent book about his participation in the Spanish Civil War, was republished. It had failed when it was originally published, but now it's both a wonderful book,
I'm trying to
also
directly to unmute the camera.
what's that? Tremendously assisted. Is something happening?
Yeah,
Tremendously.
for some reason it's unmuted. It's not muted, the camera.
You're not hearing me?
Yeah,
Join with.
If
the
we do
video.
it
I'm
here-
not getting no video from you.
You're not getting video?
Oh,
I
okay.
see myself.
Yeah. he-
Recording.
himself, but-
Recording.
Oh. I don't know.
So nobody can hear.
Okay. But I'm sorry. Yeah, what I need you to do is mute the audio in the room and click on camera. Okay, let me switch you over. Hold on.
Left. Can you hear me? Nobody's left after a half hour of technical difficulties. Maybe I don't know if it's appropriate. We can
All
stay
right, Steve,
longer.
thank you.
Can you hear me?
Okay.
Maybe we can go on a little longer than usual. But as I say,
Sure, okay.
maybe nobody's left.
There's still 48
Am I
people left.
speaking or not?
Yeah.
Hello. In a way, looking at the positive side of this, I think it indicates that computers aren't perfect, and so perhaps they won't take us over. So perhaps we won't end up in an Orwellian world after all, although it looks Orwellian is a negative adjective. Maybe there's hope for the human race. So I don't know to what degree we want to go back. Some years later, when I met William Abrams and we were talking about writing a book together, we decided we'd write a book about these 4 people who participated in the Spanish Civil War. But then it became clear that Bell and Cornford would be a separate book, which was published Journey to the Frontier in 1966. But then we launched on working on Orwell. And the idea was a sort of biographical study, but it would only go through the Spanish Civil War. It was never intended to be a total biography. The difficulty is that Orwell had said he didn't want a biography, but his literary executive, Richard Rees, said he didn't think he meant it very seriously. So in fact, at the beginning of it, we had the cooperation of Orwell's widow, his second wife, the very problematic Sonia Brownell. But then when we published the first book, Orwell had become a much more valuable property. I'm not visible. Oh yeah, there I am. A much more valuable property. And she wanted to stop our book. But on the manuscript that was cleared by lawyers and on the doctrine of fair usage, we could have some quotation. We published a book called The Unknown Orwell, which emphasized the transition from Blair to Orwell. And of course, he published Orwell, as you all know, is a pseudonym, a nom de plume, that the second book, Orwell, The Transformation, he became George Orwell because of the Spanish Civil War, but he never legally changed his name. And he's buried in a country churchyard, Sutton Courtenay, as Eric Blair. There've been a few literary studies of Orwell, but there hadn't been a biography. But now subsequently, there have been a whole series of biographies, and a new one of the best by DJ Taylor, who wrote one in 2003, and he's coming out this month with an expanded new biography of Orwell, which should be very good. But anyway, I was asked to give a talk about Orwell for Orwell exhibition at the University of New Mexico. And I gave a talk about Orwell and how he was affected by war. And his being, when he was adolescent during the First World War, obviously the Spanish Civil War and the Cold War, but the influence upon him by the First War, when he was growing up
and having a very traditional super upper class education at his boarding prep school, St. Cyprian's, and then at the most famous boarding school in England, Eton, during the war, and then his experience during the Second World War. The contribution I think that the book has to make, which has not been neglected before, but has not, I don't think, been sufficiently emphasized, how he was shaped by his experiences in the First World War when he was young, very young, and during the Second World War. And I don't think it's sufficiently, it's not neglected, but I don't think it's sufficiently appreciated how profoundly and deeply patriotic, his deep, deep, deep love of England, and how important that is for him. And he makes the distinction, which I discuss in the book, between patriotism and nationalism. Nationalism is saying we're the best country in the world and every other country should be like us. Patriotism is saying we're the best country in the world, but we're not going to impose ourselves on other countries. And that's what all of us. And so it's not unknown. William Morris, whom I'm also very interested in, has elements of this is important for him. E.P. Thompson, the famous radical historian, had a deep love of England. So the sense, England's, the famous words of William Blake, England's, we shall build Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land, which has this sort of backwards looking. One of my cliches about British history is that it's dedicated, and the monarchy is a wonderful example, that British society is dedicated to make the most radical changes, deeply radical changes, in order to become, to stay as much the same as possible. And Orwell, I think, is a wonderful example of that. And I presume to say this short book of The Socialist Patriot, I hope will provide a sort of key, I think, perhaps presumptuously, will provide a sort of key to understanding Orwell. Of course, he did have certain contradictions, but I think they're explained by a sense of patriotism is intense and very attractive, but maybe not to some. I mean, some people might have thought he was too in love with English things. The wonderful ending of the Homage to Catalonia, where he talks about this England's green and pleasant land, which is going to be bombed shortly, because he's writing it just before the shortly before the outbreak of the war. But it's full of nostalgia. It's this combination of nostalgia and radicalism, which is not a combination that you would ordinarily find. So I've gone on, and I don't know, of course, with the technical difficulties, if any of you are still out there. But Joe, I don't know.
Now you see what it was like to be in Peter's course. Very exciting, and he knew the wide breadth of information that the subject required. I have a question about the title. The Socialist Patriot are two concepts not usually linked together. The patriot, I think we do understand, and you were eloquent about that. The socialist may be a little slipperier. And since this stems in large part of the 4 sections of the book, it's World War II, in which this potentially contradictory concept really existed. Tell a bit about the war experience. This was his busiest time, I think.
Well, he was working for the BBC, for the Eastern Service, and he wanted to volunteer. Actually, ironically, I don't know how relevant it is, he had a pacifist period. When he came back from Spain, under the influence of the Independent Labour Party that he was affiliated with in order to fight in Spain, said this is an imperial war, and both Britain and Germany are both evil. But then on the day of Germany, there is that Britain have to go to war on behalf of Germany. But he wrote a book that I discussed at some length, short, very short little book he did, almost a long pamphlet. And again, it has a wonderfully evocative, revealing title. It's called The Lion and the Unicorn, which, people might be particularly aware of them at the moment, because they are the heraldic beasts that support the royal coat of arms. But the book is called The Lion and the Unicorn, Socialism and the English Genius. And then in the book, he argues, inaccurately as it turned out, that British society, under the need to mobilize to win the war, would have to become, the state will have to take over in a good way, in his view, and it would have to become a totally socialist in order to win the war. And there would have to be a revolution. But he has these wonderful sentences. England is a family, but with the wrong members in control. But he was wrong. He was both right and wrong. England didn't have to become a socialist society. It moved a bit towards being a socialist society, or quite a bit, after the war as a welfare state. But obviously there was great mobilization by the state in order to win the war. But he said, this has to happen in order to win the war. So that the war creates a situation that society has to be socialist. And it didn't become socialist, but it moved in that direction.
When you talk about this in the book, one of the interesting things is that Orwell's manner of expression is so authoritative that every time he uses his mind, it sounds as if he had never said the previous thing.
Yes.
In large part, this stems from the fact that he was secure in his own class or his own role in society.
Oh, yeah, yes. Again, an aspect that I discuss in the book, and again, is not ignored. A few authors, erroneously in my view, liked Orwell as an outsider, but he couldn't have been. He famously defines himself as a member of the lower. It's this wonderful, class is incredibly important in England, and people claim it's less important than it used to be. And that may be true. I'm not so sure. But and the English are capable of making the finest and Joe, you've had experiences in England, are making the finest sort of nuances of class differentials. And Orwell defined himself as a member of the lower, upper, middle class, which meant a member of the upper classes without money. But his grandfather was a vicar. And again, it shows current shape. I don't discuss this in the book, but it's interesting. The family money, and this is of great interest in British studies at the moment and worldwide studies as well. The family money came from Orwell's, I think, great-great-grandfather, Charles Blair, who was a slave owner in Jamaica. But the time Orwell's grandfather was a vicar, he had 10 children. Orwell's father, I think, was the youngest. He had no money, had no private income, but he was a civil servant. He was a servant of the state. Interestingly, Orwell, as you know, was born in India, where his father was an officer in the legal opium trade, the cultivation of opium in India, which is legal until 1917 or something like that. So Orwell couldn't be a figure that was more central to the state. But the wonderful thing that happens in England is that critics such as William Morris, E.P. Thompson, George Orwell, John Cornford, they have excellent schooling, and they're trained to write well, trained to think well. They frequently use the tools that they've learned to try and radically reform their society. So Orwell, but I think that his education doubts. I mean, his wonderful essay, bitter essay about his prep school education, such were the joys, But nevertheless, I think both there, and he slacked off at Eton. He didn't work very hard at Eton, but he read a lot, but he didn't work very hard. But in effect, he received an excellent education and became a brilliant writer. As you say, the apotheosis of this writing is a sense of authority, and this is the truth. But as you also say, and maybe not be sufficiently appreciated, Orwell changed his mind several, and he was from a brief pacifism period to being very, very much in favor of the war. But when he writes about it, whatever position he's taking, he writes with great authority.
Yeah, very much so. Of the 4 wars that are discussed in the book, the one that most people or readers are going to be familiar with is the Cold War. And particularly if they're young. Knowing that we were going to have this conversation, it occurred to me that I hadn't actually looked at 1984 since I first read it in, I think, high school, as you did. That's a long time ago. And one of the things that's so interesting about looking at it now is how deracinated it has become from the context in which it was originally conceived. This is no longer a book which references the shabbiness of London after World War II, or references Big Brother as Stalin, or any of the contextual details that would have been relevant to lots of readers at the time. Now we read it almost as an abstract, but consequently more universalist book. What's interesting, or was to me, is that I had forgotten a large part of this book, but what you don't forget, and which, if you look at it again, comes back with the same freshness and vivid sort of verve, is this description of the surveillance state and what was to become the surveillance state, a kind of running model almost for East Germany. And it's as fresh and gripping and interesting as it was, I think, when it came out in 1949, wouldn't you say?
Yes, yes. I mean, it's very much had a second life. Louis Menand says it in his recent book, most powerful cultural document. And it's the paradox. I mean, Orwell wouldn't have been in favor of the CIA, but yet the CIA paid for many translations of the distribution of Animal Farm in 1984. So it did have this very powerful, as did also Homage to Catalonia, who was deeply anti-communist. It had this very powerful life as a Cold War document. And then, Animal Farm in 1984 in America, and I think also in Britain, maybe less so, is read, the books are read in high school, but they continue to be read. But now, in the last couple of years, and the irony is that the Orwell estate and the sales of 1984 and particularly 1984, are deeply, deeply indebted to Donald Trump. And the alternate facts, et cetera, sales of 1984 zoomed, but also I think, and the computer glitches and AI and so forth and so on. The computers were, I don't know if they actually, well, they existed obviously because it was Bletchley, but they weren't part of people's lives. And now we have this feeling that AI is going to take us over, and computers are all powerful and they're capable of transformations and changing facts. And so 1984, I think, well, being anti-totalitarianism and being anti the Soviet system but Orwell, never wanted the Soviet system to be overthrown. What he said, let the Russians do what they want, but it mustn't go elsewhere. But that aspect is, considering the present situation with Ukraine and so forth, that aspect is significant. But I don't know if we're still there. But it's the Winston Smith running a computer and rewriting the past is our newspapers and such That's what I think that's a major thing that makes 1984 deeply relevant today. But it's not a particularly an aspect that I discuss, because my book stops with maybe I imply it, but basically it stops with Orwell's death.
It's also fascinating in how literary careers change, how the impact of a book has a life of its own and evolves in different ways. This was very much, Orwell up until the publication of these books was very much a man of the left, and certainly always considered himself
Oh,
the
yes,
left, and is now appropriated to have written the great Ord documents of the right and the anti-communists of the Cold War.
Of course, he hated that.
And to which he objected a great deal. But I love, there's one statistic in the book that between them, the two of them, Animal Farm and 1984, they have sold something like over 40 million copies worldwide. Ever written in any the encouraged for all young writers that he would touch them in the publishing, so that both reject, correct?
I know why you're saying that. He had trouble, and it was because the war was going on, and Animal Farm was clearly anti-Soviet,
right.
But it worked out very well. In that, famously, T.S. Eliot rejected it for Faber and Faber. A couple of other publishers rejected it. Then the publisher, Second Warburg, who had published Homage to Catalonia, published it. But it took him about a year and a half to work out a publisher. And by that time, the war had ended or was ending. It was clear that Russia was going to be the enemy, so to speak. And so Animal Farm was instant success. And I don't think there was any difficulty in getting 1984, because Animal Farm is, Orwell had been, sometimes exaggerated that he was a failure as a writer. He was a moderately successful, he didn't make very much money. He had to take sort of extra jobs, but he was a moderately successful middle-range novelist in the 1930s. He wasn't an unknown figure, but Animal Farm catapulted him to fame. And of course, he was only 1984 was published in, I think, June or July. And then he died in January 1950. But it got a lot of attention. He knew before he died that it was a great success.
Right. It's also it's interesting to look at now, to see what was once important but becomes less important, what is but truly always relevant. And the most, I think, impassioned pieces of this book, or passages in the book, have to do with language itself and history. Who owns the past? Who owns the past? Who owns the future? And that the degradation of language, and political language in particular, has become so much a feature of our times. I mean, as you said before, is wonderful for the book commercially, but not necessarily so wonderful for all of us.
It was one of his most famous lines, is he wanted to make political writing into an art. And that's what he did. I mean, he's a great defender of language. The famous essay, Politics and the English Language, I think it's called. That language can be, you have to think very seriously about language. It can be a crutch, it can be a smokescreen, it can make for easy thinking. But he's a brilliant writer and a master of the language.
You've been reading George Orwell and writing about George Orwell since 1949, correct?
Yes.
How do you feel about him, having spent so many decades with him? Has your opinion about him changed or evolved?
Well, of course, I'm a great admirer. I don't know if I had known him, he probably wouldn't have been interested in being a friend. Maybe, who knows? Well, I think somebody you write about, well, how can one put it? they're like relatives.
Yes.
and you know, I'm deeply involved with you. I love you very much, but sometimes, of course, you might irritate me. I don't think Orwell irritates me. You know, Orwell's not perfect. I mean, he's accused of homophobia, anti-Semitism, misogyny. And again, what fascinates me in England is, particularly in the upper middle classes and the upper classes, is these negative attitudes they have, but it's very hard. They were awful. Well, there was this terrible line, which I disagree with, but you get the point, that David Kanon wrote somewhere when he was reviewing books about Jews in England. He said, the country club is not the concentration camp. But you see, I mean, English can be incredibly nasty and teasing and make nasty remarks about people. But it's also very hard to tell how deep. I mean, they're not, it's certainly not attractive. And Orwell was, you know, talked about the Nancy poets, and he would make, and particularly out in Paris and London, he would make, before Hitler and so forth, he would make nasty remarks about Jews. But how, and obviously one wouldn't like that. But you know, it's awful, but how deep is it? It's very hard to, I've been fascinated by sort of, and other things I've written as well, English anti-Semitism. And what is it? You know, how can one put, well, I don't mean to be flip, but you can contrast it to our country. I mean, the English may make terribly nasty remarks, but they're unlikely to shoot you. and here, people might not make nasty remarks, but they might well shoot you. As I say, you have a long-term relationship with the dead. You know, somebody's obviously long dead. You know, you don't say that the person is perfect, but obviously, in many senses, you have deep affection.
Well, and you've devoted a lot of years to exploring it. So we have come to that time where we're supposed to have Q&As, but I think because of our technical difficulty, we have been speaking into a handheld iPad, which I hope has been working and is going out to whoever is actually still tuned into this webinar. But I don't think we're going to be able to do a Q&A because technically it's just not going to pop up on the screen. And we can't see the questions because we're the size of a postage stamp is what we're looking at from this end. So I hope you'll forgive us for that, but I hope you have enjoyed the time that you've spent with us. We certainly have, and we apologize for all of the technical glitches, not necessarily our fault, but not necessarily anybody else's either. Yeah, we won't point any fingers. Who we do thank very much are the Leon Levy Center and Shelby White for making all of these programs possible, even the ones that technically go slightly wrong, but we'll rectify it, I hope, with your next book. And thank you so much. What? Oh, and we have been recorded on YouTube, I think, so you can even check out our flailing around and trying to find the way back to the webinar. Anyway, thank you so much for coming. It's been a real pleasure. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, Peter.
Well, and you, Joe.
I'm sorry you're so shy and reticent. Anyway, thanks a lot, and we'll see you at the next Leon Levy event. Thanks.